Well, it's a pleasure to be up here with Christine Vachon, a rock star among film producers. Actually, Todd Haynes' next film is going to be a biopic of Christine in which Bob Dylan plays her. I thought just to get started, let's do the highly compressed version of your CV and just how you got to the point of being a producer, sort of what those early steps were.
Well, I think the most important thing is, Killer, this is 2015, is Killer's 20th anniversary. So that means we now have employees that are younger than the company. I had the great good fortune to come to New York City in the mid-'80s after college, when a lot of filmmakers were starting to make their first movies, people like Jim Jarmusch and Spike Lee and Betty Gordon, and I got to see firsthand this whole idea that you could make a cinema that was very personal, but also demanded production. And I luckily kind of got to see how those movies were put together. And at a certain point, really to cut to the chase, Todd Haynes made a film that I hope you have all illegally downloaded called Superstar: The Karen Carpenter Story. And if you haven't, go ahead and do so. And when I saw that film, I realized I wanted to make sure that Todd never made another movie without my name on it, which he has so far so good, and that those were the kinds of movies I wanted to make, movies that were provocative, entertaining, and felt like they really had something to say.
And you had, sort of been gigging around in indie film. You had sync dailies. You had worked on sets. I think a lot of people, get in at the ground level like that, and they look at the director, and he seems or she seems to be the most important person on the set, and people think that's what I want to do. But what was it about the sort of that idea of enabling people to become directors or to get their projects going that appealed to you more? Did you ever flirt with the idea of directing? Yeah,
I even directed a couple of short films. But I think that, it's the usual, people think that there's that there's this tremendous creative gap between, what a producer does, which is the money side, and then the creative side, what the director does. And of course, all of those decisions are completely intertwined with each other. I realized at a certain point that the sort of vast problem-solving nature of producing and, looking at a movie's entire life at one time was much more appealing to me. And yeah, and I love working, with first-time directors and helping people make the best movies they can, or tell the best stories they can. I mean, that's the other, thing, might be jumping ahead of us a little bit, but, I keep trying to train myself to stop saying filmmaker and start saying storyteller, because especially in the world that we're in now, that's what we're doing. We're telling stories, and most of them ain't on film.
Well, it is interesting. We were talking backstage a little bit about the idea that we need to come up with a new vocabulary to talk about this business that we work in. And in your book, A Killer Life, which I encourage people to read if they haven't, you spend a lot of time at the beginning of the book talking about the idea of what it means to be a producer, because that's sort of one of these terms like independent film that seems to have become diluted over time by a lot of people either misusing it or getting these kind of vanity credits on films as producers or executive producers when they may have had only a very tangential involvement. So in your definition of the term, what is it that a producer does?
Well, I guess, ultimately, there's a very pragmatic explanation, and then there's a slightly more esoteric explanation. The pragmatic explanation is, a producer finds the material and puts together a package of the director, the actors, the creative team, and then takes that package out and finds financing for it. You could also say the producer is the engine on a train. There's some movies we've made that have literally taken 7 to 10 years to come to the screen, you know, and during those years we've kept trying to figure out ways to advance it, to, you know, to make it more marketable, to make it appealing to this actor or to that actor, etc. But I also think, you know, there's an argument for sometimes a producer or an executive producer is simply the person who does that one thing that makes the movie, that pushes the movie over the edge, or the story, from not happening to happening. And there's also been now there's a lot of financing producers who are people who actually bring the financing to the table, but also think of themselves as creative producers, and we work with people like that a lot too.
People like Steve Rails, Megan Ellison.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, I think it gets confusing. It gets confusing to me sometimes when I'm sort of digging through IMDb to see who really produced that film. Who are all these people who are getting all these credits? You know, the producers aren't protected by the same kind of a guild as writers and directors are. And you know, like if somebody said, "I'm going to put money into your movie, but I need to share the director credit," you'd be like, yeah, that's not happening. But if somebody said, "I'm going to put money into your movie, but I need to share the producer credit," my answer would be, sure.
Well, that does explain why, you know, I'm very conscientious because I'm always doing the credits on the Variety reviews, that sometimes some movies now really will have between 20 and 30 producers of some kind. The Butler, I think, may have set a record in terms of the number that it had.
But you could also make the argument that every one of those people who got that credit made a contribution that allowed that movie to get made. That's why I think it's such a gray area, and it's so hard to come down on one side or the other.
When you look back at the 20 years of killer films, it is interesting because I think, again, we tend to think about directors as auteurs, but I think there are producers who also kind of leave a very visible stamp on a movie just in terms of the kind of material they're attracted to, the kind of stories that they're interested in bringing to the screen. It's not to say these are all the same movie, of course, but if you think about the work of Todd Haynes, the work of Todd Solondz, the work of Mary Harron and other filmmakers other films you've been involved with, Boys Don't Cry, of course, being one of the most notable, Kids by Larry Clark, there does seem to be some kind of through line here in terms of the sorts of projects that get you excited.
Well, I mean, you know, it's just one of those, like, we know it when we see it. And I think there might be some kind of a through line, but it has more to do with really responding to stories, maybe a lot of stories about outsiders, a lot of stories that feel like they're not traditional in the usual, you know, ambiguous heroes, you know, unlikable characters, things like that. But, you know, we're also attracted to nice movies, too, sometimes.
Like 1 Hour Photo.
Exactly.
Finally, a film the whole family can enjoy.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about how you and your partner in killer films, Pam Koffler, kind of divide and conquer. How do you function as producers? What does one do a certain set of things and the other, or it's a totally fluid sort of back and forth?
It's much more organic. You know, I mean, I guess one of Killer's other great achievements is a partnership that has lasted 20 years, which, you know, that's a tremendous amount of work and commitment, and it's really paid off, because you know, one of the things young filmmakers often ask, young storytellers often ask me is, you know, when they're starting out, I think it's more important than ever to build a sense of community amongst storytellers. And what I'm seeing more and more is people trying to form these partnerships, you know, when they start out, so that they can all work on each other's movies or you know, or web series or whatever. with Pam and I, it's kind of like one of us will sort of slide into one film more than the other because of circumstance, relationship with the director perhaps, you know, happens to be available at that time and the other one isn't. But I will say Still Alice, which is, you know, our latest movie that, you know, had the tremendous good fortune to win an Oscar. That was really Pam's baby. Like she really took care of it.
One of the things, this quote by you has the bad word filmmakers in it, so I'll actually I could substitute storytellers, but I'll read it as it is. You say, it always blows my mind how little so many burgeoning filmmakers know about their own craft. And you say that in the book, talking about Kimberly Peirce coming in and kind of blowing everybody away with her incredible knowledge of film history when she was pitching Boys Don't Cry, and the way she was able to relate things in the film to things in other films and other sort of narratives that we have in the culture and that kind of thing. What advice do you have to young burgeoning storytellers in terms of learning more about their craft? Is this an advocacy to go to film school, or is it
no?
No.
Oh no. Unless it's my film school, because we are running a film school now. I do think every great filmmaker / storyteller I know, and that means like kids who show me, who are 21 or 22, who are giving me their short films on the street corner of Austin, which happens, or you know, filmmakers who've got a few movies behind them, or television series or what have you. They watch everything. That's the common link. They really do. They watch a ton of movies, television. They take pleasure in the work of others. I mean, it's really the common denominator. You know, and I am surprised when I meet somebody who wants to be a filmmaker or storyteller. I don't want to get boring with this, but anyway, I'm trying. And that's not part of their routine, you know, learning about the work of other filmmakers.
Well, let's talk about some of the changes that you have sort of witnessed in the business in the 20 years of Killer and the almost 30 years now that you've been working in film in some way. I think, you know, we read so much about digital, how digital technology has made it possible for anyone to make a film, how it's sort of collapsed all of the old distribution models. But, you know, from sort of your point of view as a producer who's going out and trying to raise money and trying to get things made, has digital been the main sort of game changer? Are there other things? Is digital not as big a deal as maybe it's made out to be in other sectors of the industry, like exhibition? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's so many game changers, but it's also, you know, it's also like that French proverb, the more it changes, the more it stays the same. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, right now we're at a time where every day we're told, you know, theatrical feature filmmaking is over. It's dying, and it's being replaced by all these other things. But Killer is making more theatrical feature films than we have ever made. I mean, we kind of are making more than we can handle. And I'll get into the reasons for that in a second, or what I perceive are some of the reasons for that. So I think that, you know, what the advent of shooting on digital as opposed to film has, you know, as there's a downward pressure on our budgets, the sort of how we manage our our long form content, movies, whatever it is, has adjusted, you know, for shorter shoots, for, you know, quicker preps, for all those, you know, for everything to kind of speed up so that we can, you know, still manage to tell certain types of stories on certain types of budgets. You know, theatrical feature films, for the most part, are still being financed on the independent side the way they have been for years, which is, you know, foreign sales-based pre-sales, which is, you know, which is a drag. And it's a model that, that doesn't work that well, especially as, you know, there's economic woes in the countries that we used to depend on to really, you know, give us the kind of hefty, juicy pre-sales that got our movies financed. But we don't really have something significant to replace it with yet. So there's that. So that's like the glass half empty version. But the glass half full version really is simply, there's so many more platforms, and there's so many different ways to exploit your content. Honestly, I think for some of us, it's just kind of like navigating and figuring out the way to make it really work for you, you know, and work for your piece of content. Ultimately, I think that the question we ask ourselves every day at Killer, and Killer is now, we are now calling ourselves Killer Content, by the way. See, I'm getting rid of film any way I can. Killer Content, we ask ourselves, what makes something theatrical? Like, why is this script theatrical? What is going to make you, a consumer, decide to go out and see it opening weekend? Is it the actors? Is it the story? What is it, you know? And what we're realizing is that some stories may not be theatrical, but that still doesn't mean they aren't good, and that we don't still want to make them, and that they don't still have an audience. And that's, I think, sort of the crossroad we're at. And I know some of the other, you know, some of the other keynote people have been talking about, you know, embracing VOD, and it's not bad for something to go out on VOD, et cetera. I think that's all right, but I also feel we're starting to look at the way we consume media is actually starting to affect those particular stories on the platforms that they appear.
And it's kind of a complicated chain, right? Because I know our friend Ted Hope got into some contentious back and forth about a year ago when he wrote an article that was actually in response to an article in the New York Times about, you know, the fact that there are too many indie movies now. That was the position of the New York Times. And then Ted said, well, actually, the New York Times should be reviewing every movie that shows on any digital platform anywhere in the world. And that does sort of beg this question about, well, things are still very much oriented around the theatrical model because there are certain perks that come with releasing a film theatrically in terms of its media visibility that haven't quite been replicated yet in the VOD sphere, unless you're doing VOD and theatrical together. So is you know, we can change the way we release movies, but in a way, there's certain other things down the line that kind of have to shift too, if that's going to ever become the dominant way of doing things, right?
That's right. I mean, but I also find there's certain resistance. I mean, we've started working with filmmakers, storytellers who are very well versed in transmedia and kind of naturally are able to take their stories and say, well, this is the story I want, this is the movie version of my story, but here's the, you know, here's the game version, here's the episodic version, here's the version you should watch on your iPhone. Like, they just click right into that world. But if I try and pitch that to a traditional movie executive, their response is usually like, let's get to the movie part. Like, who's in it? Who's in it? You know? And so that being able to sort of crack open some of that still feels like it's not quite in our grasp. I mean, look, I'm just talking about my world. I'm sure there's plenty of you they're like, we're doing it, you know? Like, and these folks are doing it. But I'm just talking about like where we're at right now, where Killer is right now. I still find it surprisingly hard to really talk in less than the abstract about how you crack open, you know, getting a movie out there that may not have a traditional theatrical road.
You produced for Todd Haynes' Mildred Pierce on HBO,
Right.
and of course, one of the other sort of big buzz topics in the last few years has been this sort of renaissance of television, particularly in the cable and pay cable sphere, long form programming like Mildred Pierce, like Olive Kitteridge, like True Detective,
Right.
and so forth, and that you don't sort of have the biases that used to exist where, you know, TV and film people were very separate, and now you see a lot of really A-list film talent wanting to work in television, or at least this kind of television. Is that something you see continuing, or the television is even going to sort of keep rising in its prominence?
Absolutely. I mean, I think ultimately, you know, there's been this, like, you know, as independent films have become more risk averse, and we're not going to take chances on that new actor or that new director, or that story's too much of a downer, et cetera. Like, and you know, those are the rooms I sit in. That's, you know, those are the frustrations I deal with. As it's pulling back, TV's like, well, we will, you know, like, as long as it's a fresh voice and it you know, that kind of originality seems to have moved over. But I also think it's interesting to talk about, like, well, you know, what makes TV, you know? Like, Transparent, like, you know, cleans up at the Emmys, you know, or no, the Golden Globes, right? Sorry. Yeah, Emmys haven't happened yet. But in the television category.
Right.
And so I think that, again, that those distinctions, and I just was speaking at my alma mater at Brown University, and where I was speaking to a very, you know, a crowd well-versed in film theory, very different kind of crowd. And then we got into a discussion of, like, the televisionness of, like, one show over another. And I was just like, it just depends where, you know, we're all just, you know, we're watching it on our computers. So that's, you know, so that's just that, those lines just start to blur.
Well, that sort of begs the question again. I mean, one of these sort of much abused or misunderstood or devalued terms is independent film. You talk about that a bit in the book,
Right.
in that, you know, you have films that are called independent that are fully financed by major studios. Then I think we've all had that experience of going to festivals and seeing a quote-unquote independent film that is basically a classical sort of Hollywood story just done on a lower budget.
Right.
So it may have been independently financed, but the thinking behind the film is not really very independent. Do you have sort of a working personal definition of what makes a film an independent film?
I guess really all it can kind of come down to is it the result of a singular vision? Mm-hmm. You know, does it feel, you know, does it have that kind of, you know, auteuriness of feeling like this is, you know, this film really couldn't have been made by anybody else, you know? It's hard because, you know, everything is such a hybrid now, you know, and it'll be a little studio money, a little money from foreign sales, a little money from a, you know, a financing creative producer, and, you know, and that's your soup. So how do you decide what makes it, you know, that one gets to be independent and that one doesn't, you know? And I mean, I think that was very apparent at the Indie Spirit Awards, you know, which I think, you know, at some point it was like, if this is just a rerun of the Oscars, why are we having them, you know?
Well, what do you think are what are the biggest challenges for somebody starting out today who wants to tell stories? I mean, we've talked about all of the new opportunities that there are, and I know that Pam's talked about that also in interviews, that, you know, that even for the kind of movies Killer is making, there's more sort of platforms and ways of doing them now.
Right.
So what are the obstacles? What are the stumbling blocks?
You know, I think it's kind of, well, first I'll say, this is really what my advice to somebody starting out is. I think a lot of people come out with when I say come out of what? Come out of, I guess, school, come into the workforce. Let's say that. People come into the workforce and they have very pre-existing ideas of what they, you know, I want to be a director, I want to be a writer, I want to be a producer. You know, this is the path I've chosen, and this is, and I'm just gonna, I'm going to only do things that feel as if they will advance that goal. When in fact, in storytelling, one of the most amazing things is there's so many different creative ways to be involved in how movies, television, whatever is put together. And what I always tell people is just walk through the doors that open for you. And if you thought you wanted to work in, you know, narrative, but you get offered a job in documentary, just take it, because then you're in the world. And if you thought you wanted to be, you know, in the cinematography department, but you get offered, you know, a job in the art department or whatever, just do it, because it just exposes you to all the different ways these stories are told. One thing, you know, I think we talk about a lot that, you know, is hard is this whole notion of we all have to be entrepreneurs. And I'm sure you've been hearing it all weekend. Everyone has to be an entrepreneur. And I would say that's yes and no. Because yes, it is about thinking, you know, thinking outside of your own box. But I also think in some ways it's more about teaching your brain to take those leaps rather than actually saying, what, I have to be a filmmaker and I have to know how to market my movie and I have to know how to finance my movie. Like, that's just too damn much. Why can't I just be the creative person I want to be? And the idea, I think, is you can be. You absolutely can be. You just have to flexibilize your brain, and that is entrepreneurship in my mind. And sometimes it's just about finding the person who thinks that, like, knowing how to marketing a movie is really cool, and they'll work with you, and you start to form your community. And that's, you know, community in our day and age, you know, in what we're trying to do and the stories we're trying to tell is really critical.
Well, sort of on a related note to that, there's been so much talk sort of in this past Oscar season and beyond about the idea of representation on and off screen, sort of, or on screen and behind the scenes in movies. That the idea that we need, you know, more stories about women, people of color, more filmmakers who are women or people of color, this kind of thing. And so again, it kind of seems to be at odds with the idea that there's all these new platforms, there's all these opportunities, and yet we still seem to be seeing a lot of the same kinds of stories being told. I mean, Killer has a fantastic record of working with women filmmakers and telling very unusual and atypical stories, but it's hardly the norm. And why is that? Why is the needle moving so slowly in that direction?
I don't want to give the usual conventional answers. I mean, it's tough. Female-driven dramas are tough. They're tough to get made, and even when you even on a movie like Still Alice, when you get somebody as extraordinary as Julianne Moore, the financiers are like, so who's going to play her husband? And you're like, but we got Kristen Stewart to play her daughter. Who's going to play the husband? And that's just, that seems to just be endemic. And, it's part of what I go back to in terms of, without getting too deeply into it, this whole notion of foreign sales-based financing and the pressure on cast and the sort of unrealistic pressure on cast. I guess, which is all a way of saying, I feel like it is changing slowly. It's probably changing much more rapidly in the other platforms. I mean, television, I think, has already left us behind in the dust and is like, what do you mean female-driven stories aren't what people want to see? Hello? Like, that's what we're, this is what we're, and women are extremely prolific in those fields. In the film business, look, we fight the good fight, obviously. And every time we manage to get one of those movies out of the gate, and it's like threading the needle. Like Still Alice was, every step of the way was a battle. It's like, this is a movie about Alzheimer's. Who's going to want to see that? That was the the basic refrain. And every you make a movie like that, it has to be good.
Yeah.
the critics have to like it, and sometimes they don't, even when it's good. uh, and then the people have to like it. And that's like, each one of those is like threading a needle in a snowstorm. So we will continue to do so, but I don't have the cut and dried answer about why the film business has resisted what every other entertainment business has seemed to embrace.
I think one of the things that's so impressive about Killer is the sort of long-term relationships that you've had with a number of filmmakers. I mean, Todd Haynes is obviously the most prominent because you've produced everything, but
except Superstar.
Except Superstar, which was shown here a few years ago, which was a real thrill to see it on the big screen. But some of the other people we mentioned, like Todd Solondz and Mary Harron and that kind of thing. What is you so often hear about directors who are at odds with producers, and these kind of nightmare stories of, movies that are recut in the editing room, and obviously very high-profile example recently with Kenneth Lonergan and Margaret. But every couple of years you have Paul Schrader with his last movie. These kind of stories, and what is the key to having not just a good relationship but a sustainable one where you actually become kind of partners in a way over the course of a long career?
Well, you should be partners, but I think the real key is you really have to make sure that everyone's making the same movie. And that sounds easy, but I've been in lots of situations, maybe not lots, but enough situations to know I don't want to ever be in them again, where you realize that, and it doesn't just apply to the producer and the director, it applies also to the financier, that you're not making the same film. That the financier thought he or she was making this one, but the director's actually making, something far less commercial, perhaps, or not the comedy the financier thought they were getting involved in, or not the kind of movie I thought I was getting involved in. And that's the key to me is really figuring that out from the get-go, and sometimes parting ways if that's not clear. I mean, I like working with directors again and again because we have a shorthand. Directors, for the most part, know that we're all just trying to make the movie as good as it can be, but those creative decisions, those financial decisions that are also creative decisions, again, that goes back to the core of, if I believe in this director's vision, and if I believe that he or she, is making the movie that we've all been talking about, then we can have discussions about, like, we've got to cut the budget because this is all the money we have. Can we cut that scene or this scene? I mean, one of the things that that the downward pressure on the budgets has caused is it's forced us to interrogate the scripts in a way we almost never have had to before, of just like, is this in the service of the story? Mm-hmm. Like, what is this, how is this advancing our narrative? And I think that sometimes that makes for stronger storytelling, You lose a lot of the shoe leather, and you lose maybe, and there's some filmmakers who would say, but sometimes you want a little bit more on that jury, and I get it, on that journey, and I get that. I think Still Alice is a good example, because at a certain point we realized to make that movie for the budget that we had to figure out how to make it all in service of Julianne's performance, because that was really what the movie was about.
Yeah, and when people read Christine's book, if they haven't, I think one of the most fascinating case studies that you do in there is about the editing of Boys Don't Cry, and how that movie went from being a sort of 4-hour rough cut with lots of stuff that never made it onto the screen.
See, maybe now we'd make it as a miniseries, because all that stuff was great.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Well, I'm wondering if you agree, because I think a lot of people who do what I do feel like we go to festivals or even see movies that are about to open and often feel that they're not produced enough. you know, that I think it's something you tend to associate sometimes with filmmakers who are very far along in their career, have sort of, they get to the point where they have carte blanche or final cut and they make megalomaniacal, excessive movies. But I think you often see it with young filmmakers just starting out, that you feel like, oh, there's a lot of interesting ideas in that movie, and if only that person had somebody next to them who was sort of helping to shape that vision, a kind of outside voice, which I think artists often need because they are so inside their own head in a way.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of comes back to the, you know, I feel like, you know, we try and nurture young producers for that very reason. I think it is, you know, it's a real craft being able to, you know, help enhance a director's vision that way, and point out, you know, like the things, you know, be the honest voice and point out the things that are not working in service of the story.
I'm going to turn it over now to some questions from the audience for Christine. I think there's some microphones there, so just queue up. Start over there, Jim.
Jim Forat from Real Deal. Christine, first of all, thank you for sticking with Walsh and Richard with all the obstacles that were presented in the making of Still Alice. It was well worth it from an audience point of view. I have 2 questions. One is about Tangerine was shot on a cell phone, and it seemed to be the appropriate camera to use for that particular film. But what does that mean from a producer's point of view? Does it open up thousands of bad movies that you're going to, or projects that you're going to have to deal with, or is it going to open up a new way of storytelling? And I'll hold the second question until you answer that.
Well, I mean, the key thing that you said was that it was shot on a cell phone, which was appropriate for the story it was telling. And that's really that's the key thing. I mean, in the 90s, we coined an expression. I think Ted claims that he coined it, and James Schamus claimed that he coined it. I don't claim I coined it, but I certainly have copied it a lot, which is let your budget be your aesthetic. And that the idea behind that was, you know, to make the limitations work in favor of your narrative instead of like bumping up against them. And when you bump up against them, you're sort of pointing them out. You know, you're kind of saying to the audience, well, I didn't really have enough money for a period car, so I'm using this instead. And instead of just saying like, well, I didn't have enough money for that, so my narrative is going to be in a place where there are no cars, you know? So, you know, is that going to mean that we're going to see a lot of cell phone movies? Maybe, but that's okay. I mean, if somebody can really crack it and tell a great story that way, you know, there's a movie I love that Andrew Neil directed called King Kelly that also uses cell phones and web technology a lot in its narrative, and I thought it was fantastic.
The second question has to do with what happened to the Spirit Awards. They seem to be...
I'm not the person to ask that. I have nothing to do with it.
No. From a producer's point of view, okay, originally they were devoted to the indie film, and it seems to be very much so similar to what happens with the Oscars. Is there, from a producer's point of view, has it lost its gravitas for the independent filmmaker?
You know, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble no matter what I say. You know, this year was the first time I'd been to the Spirits in years because they had this bad habit of not nominating our films. And so I was a little, you know, even though the last time I'd been there, it had still been in that, you know, big tent. This time it felt even more like, you know, like a fancy, glammy VIP event. No, I mean, and you know, maybe some people would say, well, why shouldn't indie films have that? I guess it would be nice if the Spirits felt like they were a real alternative. You know, that's the bottom line. If it felt like, if it wasn't like, oh, Birdman wins here, Birdman wins there, or, you know, like it just felt like different kinds of movies were being celebrated. And I think that that's kind of a major overhaul, and I don't know if that's something that they're prepared to do. And I'm not on any boards or anything. I don't have anything to do with it. And now I've probably just made sure I will not be invited again. And my films will continue to be irritatingly unnominated.
The only small thing I'd add to that is having been a few years on the nominating committee for this, the Spirits do have these awards that kind of get totally not even mentioned on the TV show, that are these grant awards given to undistributed films and young documentary filmmakers and young producers and that sort of thing. So there is a component there that's still sort of a little bit more true blue indie, but it's not what gets all the glam attention. Yeah. Over here. Yeah.
Hi, Christine. My name is Justin Kanaki. I am a one-time web series producer who's now getting back into filmmaking after a while. And I had a question.
Storytelling.
So yes, exactly. I never got out of storytelling. But how do you promote what you think of as outsider or independent voices to the mainstream audiences that traditionally only show up for the stories they already know and want to see more of?
I mean, that's a big question. I think that, you know, part of it is, I mean, in some ways, I feel like essentially that's really what crowdfunding is all about, is about building an audience very early in your process that's invested in you, that you can kind of, that kind of grows from that seed, you know? To me, crowdfunding is far more about community building than it is about fundraising. And I think it's a tool for, you know, for storytellers now to really, you know, reach out to you know, people that could, you know, could really turn into have a pretty large scale commitment to you. You know, otherwise it's just like, you know, how do we get people to see our movies? It's kind of the same, you know, attach talent that people want to go see. You know, will people go see Julianne and Still Alice even if they'd never go see a little independent film about Alzheimer's? We're sort of betting that they will, you know, or at least enough of them will to make the movie profitable. And those are really the kinds of tools we have.
Thank you.
Back on this side.
Hi, my name is Amy, and I'm an undergrad film student. And
hey, sorry, you're going to have to speak a lot louder than that.
My name is Amy, and I'm an undergrad film student. And you said that it tends to be a challenge with everybody involved in making the film to understand that you're all making the same film. So what's some advice you can give to make sure that happens when making a film?
Some advice on how to make sure everyone knows they're making the same film?
Yeah, sorry, I worded that.
I mean, I guess it's one of those things that kind of works at every level, because it's, I make sure that the director and I understand what our expectations are for the movie that we're making, not just in terms of the production of it, but that's a big thing, you know, what the production's gonna look like, feel like, how long it's gonna be, you know, all of those things, the kind of actors, the kind of crew, all of the things that go into what makes, you know, the production live and breathe. And then that kind of fans out to, you know, the director of photography, the costume designer, everything. And that's done in, you know, the ways in which I can articulate and the director can articulate what the vision is. Once he or she and I know what the vision is, I will take care of maybe of my corner, which is the financiers, you know, the potential distributors who've pre-bought the film, and make sure that they understand that this is what they bought. And the director will make sure that his or her creative team understands that this is what they're working on. Sometimes that's through the use of lookbooks or just, you know, other visual media, but that's really what it's about.
Hi, Christine. First, thank you for coming and sharing your experiences with us tonight, because this was amazing. My name is Darren. I'm from New York. I play in the digital world, and I'm also a filmmaker. And first, I just want to say I totally agree with you. The filmmakers need to be more open as far as what kind of stuff they do, and that's kind of what I do. I'm actually launching a co-working space for filmmakers right now. But what I really wanted to ask is, I'm working with a brilliant filmmaker who's in New York, and you mentioned something about the fact that filmmakers need to have some type of name attached to their films, and I see there's a lot of big name stars who are going into the indie market right now. How do you recommend that filmmakers who maybe only have 1 or 2 projects in their pocket, how do they reach out to those kind of actors and actresses to kind of get them attached, or at least get their projects into their hands?
How do you get a big actor to pay attention to your movie?
Sure.
Okay. That's a tough one. And sometimes the answer is just keep making work that doesn't necessarily have a big actor attached to it, but that is great storytelling, so that you can start to garner that kind of attention. And it's usually, I mean, look, most actors want to be in something good, and they want to work with directors that they think are interesting and innovative, but also that they trust. So sometimes the more work you can show that shows that you actually know what you're doing can really help. When I sit down with actors, because I sit down with a lot of them, and we have our little chitty chat about, oh, what are you doing next? I always ask one question, though, before they leave. I say, would you consider a first-time director? And the answers are always kind of all over the map. Sometimes the actor who, maybe this is an actor in a television show who is desperate to do an independent film, and there's quite a few of those, will say, yes, without question, I absolutely will. If the material's good, I will. Maybe it's an actor who's done that once or twice and has been burned, and not because of like the no trailer and the shitty food, but because they didn't feel like they were in good hands, because they were like, it felt like, no one was running the ship, or, they did like the material, but they got out there and they were like, oh, Jesus, what have I done? What have I let myself in for? So I find that if you appeal to an actor with something that he or she that isn't in their world already, like this is a chance for you to be funny when you're not funny, or be serious when you're not usually serious. Those are often the parts that an actor will consider doing something smaller for. But it's very important, if you blow your experience with the name actor because it was disorganized and you didn't really know what you wanted. As we say, my indecision is final. You're blowing it for the rest of us.
Thank you.
Hey, Christine. My name's Calvin Herbst, and I'm a junior at Richardson High School out of Dallas, Texas. And I'm really lucky to have a film program at my school that lets us do like a lot of storytelling. And so we make a lot of short stuff, which is really fun. And so I get a lot of hands-on experience. But obviously the next step is like, what do I do for college? And on one hand, a lot of people are like, film school is awesome because you make a ton of connections. You're with people who make a lot of stuff. And even though they didn't learn a lot of stuff, they made a lot of connections that help them later. But on the other hand, it's really expensive, and you put like a really heavy negative connotation on it. So can you elaborate on that? Yeah, it sounded like you did. I mean, what's your thoughts on film school?
What are my thoughts on film school?
Yeah.
It's complicated because I think that, and I've taught in a lot of film schools, and I've taught on the undergraduate level and on the graduate level, and I've also then gone and spoken at tons and tons of schools. So I've gotten glimpses into a lot of different kinds of departments. And I think that a lot of them are clip joints, and a lot of them, the majority of the faculty has never actually had to earn their living in film, so they don't really understand what's at stake. And I think that kind of has a big, that makes a big impression on the undergraduates or graduates that they're teaching. We actually started a graduate film program at Stony Brook in New York, really specifically as a way to address, can I turn film school on its ear and really make a program that's relevant? And I think we're about, a year old, and I think so far it's really worked. And the other thing about, I know this sounds like an advertisement for this, but sorry, it's affordable. It's, you know, it's a quarter of the price of most graduate film programs. So, you know, I think it's up in the air. I think that you will build community if you go work on a film set too. And if you can afford film school and it gives you a chance to sort of, you know, hone your craft in a fairly safe environment, then I think that's fine. If you don't have those kind of means, or you don't feel like entering into the working force $150,000 in debt, then I would say just get out there into the workforce, you know, and you'll learn a lot from people who are, you know, doing it for a living.
I mean, if you're hiring someone, does it matter to you that they have a degree, or
No.
So it's depends on their actual work.
No, I'm sure your parents are like, would you stop telling him that?
Mom's not here, so you're good right now.
But I couldn't tell you where any of the people I've hired have gone to college.
All right, thank you.
I think we'll have time for one more over here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rita Moraes. I'm from Brazil, and I have a company called Los Bragas. I hope one day we get to co-produce with you. And the company is only 3 years old, so we are celebrating the beginning of our venture. And as you're celebrating 20 years of venture, I would love to hear if you could give yourself a piece of advice 17 years ago, what would that be?
You know, I don't look back very often. I really just look ahead. So I can't really go back except, you know, buy more real estate. Like, you know, that was, you didn't realize that was the last big producer's fee you were going to get, and you should have just invested it, and, you know, that kind of, don't send your kid to private school, you idiot. Those are kind of my big advice. But what I'll say, in the tradition of answering the question I'd rather answer, I'd say to keep a company together for 20 years. How do you do that? And a lot of that, I think, for Killer, my partner Pam says sometimes, Killer, we're like the cockroaches in the nuclear blast. We just learned how to eat plaster and survive. And I think that's, we have learned how to eat plaster. And that just means, like, okay, this is changing radically right now, and we got to figure it the fuck out. And we can't cling to the old models. We've got to try and get ahead of it. Whether it's like, okay, that film genie has left the bottle, got to figure out the digital thing. Whether it's like, ooh, theatrical's changing, and we can't count on North American sales anymore, for the budgets of our movies. We've got to figure that out. All of those things we've just always tried to be a little ahead of, so that we could make sure we could stay in business.
Thank you.
And that's it. We just want to stay in business.
Thank you.
Christine Vachon, the plaster-eating cockroach of movie producers. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
If that dream is just about the thing you want to accomplish and you don't even know why you want it, I mean, it's too small. It may take your attention, but you're not really winning. You may achieve it, but you're not growing from it. You're just going from thing to thing. It may look like success from the outside, but if you don't even truly know why you're doing it, then your cause and effect will be off, and you're not going to be fully, truly living your dream. So.